This book is responsible for the death of a woman, the banning of a movie, and the release of thousands of white mice into a crowded theater. The regime hated this book so much, they tried to erase it from history. They burned it, they banned it, they hunted down the author's family, and when they couldn't reach him, they executed his sister for a novel about sad teenagers. Why? Because it contained a specific truth that acted like poison to the Nazi ideology. A truth so dangerous that one of the most powerful military forces in human history, tanks, secret police, absolute control over most of Europe, decided their greatest enemy was a paperback. Not a manifesto, not a political treatise. Fiction, made-up people doing made-up things. But here's what made it worse. The author wasn't some armchair intellectual making things up. He'd been there. He'd lived it. He'd crawled through the same mud and watched the same friends die. And then he wrote it all down. To understand why this book terrified them, you have to understand the specific lie the entire Nazi empire was built on. If this book was true, the Nazi Party could not exist. Erich Maria Remarque was 18 years old when he was drafted into the German army in 1916. Think about that. 18. Most of us at 18 were worried about exams or relationships. Remarque was handed a rifle and shipped to the Western Front, the most horrific killing field in human history up to that point. He was assigned to a unit that did the worst jobs, laying barbed wire, digging trenches, building fortifications, all of it under artillery fire, all of it surrounded by death. In July 1917, he was hit. Shrapnel wounds to his left leg, right arm, and neck. He spent the rest of the war in a German military hospital, watching other broken young men get wheeled in and out. Some recovered, many didn't. When the war ended, Remarque went home. But home didn't make sense anymore. The people who'd stayed behind couldn't understand what he'd seen. They asked him questions he couldn't answer. They expected him to be the same boy who'd left. But that boy was gone, buried somewhere in the mud of France. The patriotic speeches that had sent him to war now sounded like sick jokes. He drifted through odd jobs, teacher, salesman, journalist, carrying the war inside him like a stone. He tried not to think about it. For almost a decade, he tried. Then, in 1927, he started writing. The novel poured out of him in 6 weeks. He called it Im Westen nichts Neues. We know it as All Quiet on the Western Front. It was published in 1929. Within a year, it sold over 1 million copies in Germany alone. Translated into dozens of languages, a phenomenon, and it made some very powerful people very, very angry. The novel follows Paul Bäumer, a 19-year-old German soldier, through the meat grinder of World War I. And when I say meat grinder, I mean it literally. The Western Front was a 400-mile scar across Europe where men lived like rats in trenches filled with mud, corpses, and their own waste. For 4 years, millions of men faced each other across a narrow strip of devastated earth called no man's land. They went over the top into machine gun fire for a few yards of dirt. They watched their friends get blown apart by artillery. They bayoneted boys their own age who spoke a different language. The Battle of the Somme alone killed over 1 million men. 1 million. For a few miles of ground that would be lost again within months. And Remarque didn't flinch. He wrote it exactly as he had lived it. Here's Paul describing a bombardment. The earth bursts before us. It rains clods. My sleeve is torn away by a splinter. No glory, no heroism. Just a teenager checking to see if his arm is still attached. He writes about the injuries. We see men go on living with the top of their skulls missing. We see men without mouths, without jaws, without faces. This isn't poetry, it's a horror movie. And Remarque made you live inside it. He wrote about the hunger, the lice that never stopped crawling, the rats that grew fat on corpses, the way young men aged decades in months, the way they forgot what it felt like to be clean, to be safe, to be human. We have become wild beasts. We do not fight. We defend ourselves against annihilation. This was the truth Remarque carried home. And now he was sharing it with millions, which brings us to the people who needed that truth to disappear. By the late 1920s, Germany was a mess. The war had ended in 1918 with defeat. The Kaiser fled. A fragile democracy called the Weimar Republic took over, and everything was falling apart. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of territory, military power, and pride. Hyperinflation in 1923 made the currency worthless. People carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. Then the Great Depression hit and unemployment skyrocketed. Millions of Germans were hungry, humiliated, and desperate for someone to blame. Enter the Nazis. Their pitch was simple. Germany didn't lose World War I on the battlefield. Germany was betrayed. Stabbed in the back by Jews, communists, and weak politicians. The German soldier was undefeated. The German spirit was invincible. All they needed was another chance. This was called the stab in the back myth. Remember that lie. It's the foundation of everything. Their ideology required people to believe war was noble, that dying for your country was the highest honor, that German soldiers were superhuman warriors, that the next war would be glorious. They needed young men willing to march into the guns again. And then along comes this book. This quiet, devastating book that says, actually, no. War is hell. Soldiers aren't heroes, they're victims. There's nothing noble about dying alone in the mud. The old men who sent us to die were liars. And at worst, it was written by someone who'd been there. A German veteran, one of their own. Remarque wasn't a communist or revolutionary. He was just a veteran who wrote down what he saw. But that was enough, because the truth was the one thing the Nazi myth couldn't survive. So they decided to kill it. The Nazis went after all quiet like it had personally insulted their mothers. First came the smear campaign. They called Remarque a traitor, a coward, a French Jew. He was none of these things, but facts were never their strong suit. They claimed his real name was Kramer, spelled backwards, a lie so stupid it's almost impressive. Yet it circulated for decades. Nazi newspapers called the book a betrayal of the German soldier. They questioned his war record. They questioned everything except the actual content, because they couldn't. Then came the disruption. When the American film adaptation premiered in Berlin in December 1930, Joseph Goebbels, a man who looked like a skeleton cosplaying as a politician, organized gangs of brown shirts to storm the theaters. And here's where it gets absurd. They released white mice into the audience. Hundreds of them. Women screamed. Men jumped onto their seats. The projector kept rolling while chaos erupted in the dark. They threw stink bombs. They set off sneezing powder. They beat up moviegoers in the lobby and on the streets outside. Night after night, the chaos continued. The police did nothing. The government did nothing. Eventually, the authorities gave in. The film was banned within a week. The official reason? Damaging to German prestige. Mice in a movie theater. To stop people from watching a film about sad soldiers. This was their intellectual engagement with ideas they didn't like. Rodents and fists. They couldn't argue with the book, so they released vermin instead. That tells you everything you need to know. Then came the fire. May 10th, 1933. Berlin. The regime had been in power for barely 3 months. 40,000 people gathered in the Opernplatz. 20,000 books were fed to the flames while Goebbels screamed about spiritual cleansing. All quiet on the Western Front was one of the first thrown in. Remarque had already fled to Switzerland. His citizenship was revoked. His books were banned. He was safe. But the Nazis weren't done. This is the part where I need you to pay attention. Remarque was beyond their reach. He was in Switzerland, then the United States, living in exile while his homeland descended into madness. If they couldn't touch him. So they found the next best thing. His sister, Elfriede Schultz, a dressmaker living in Dresden. A 46-year-old woman who made clothes for a living. A civilian whose only crime was sharing blood with a man who wrote a book. They arrested her in 1943. The charge was undermining morale. She had allegedly made comments critical of the war. Maybe she said Germany was losing. Maybe she said something about the bombing raids that were destroying German cities. We don't know exactly what she said. It doesn't matter. They weren't really interested in her words. The trial was a farce. The verdict was predetermined. And the judge, Roland Freisler, one of the most notorious figures in the regime, made the real reason clear. He actually said to her, in open court, "Your brother is unfortunately beyond our reach. You, Kats, however, will not escape us." He said that out loud, on the record. They weren't even pretending anymore. This wasn't about justice. This was revenge, pure and simple. They sentenced her to death. On December 16th, 1943, Elfriede Schultz was executed. She was 46 years old because her brother wrote a fiction book about how war is bad. Remarque didn't learn of her death until after the war ended, 2 years later. Imagine finding that out. Imagine carrying that weight for the rest of your life. He later dedicated his novel, Spark of Life, to her memory. Just 2 words, to Elfriede. If you ever want to understand fascism, understand this. They didn't burn books because they were strong. They burned them because they were scared. And when burning wasn't enough, they killed whoever they could reach. So why was this particular book so dangerous? It wasn't because Remarque was a communist. He wasn't. It wasn't because he called for revolution. He never joined a party, never led a movement, never gave a political speech in his life. It was because he made you feel it. Here's the passage that contains the nuclear bomb. Paul has just killed a French soldier in a shell crater, stabbed him, then spent hours trapped with him, watching him slowly die. "Comrade, I did not want to kill you, but you were only an idea to me before, an abstraction that lived in my mind and called forth its appropriate response. It was that abstraction I stabbed, but now, for the first time, I see you are a man like me." Read that again. Let it sink in. This is what terrified them. The enemy isn't a monster. He's a guy with a wife and a mother who will never see him again. He had dreams. He had fears. He probably didn't want to be there either. And you killed him because some old man in a clean uniform told you to. The Nazis needed their enemies to be subhuman. They needed the French, the British, the Jews, the Slavs to be abstractions. Ideas to be hated, not people to be understood. Their entire system depended on it. Remarque looked at the enemy and said, "He's just like you." That one idea could destroy their entire worldview. The book doesn't lecture, it just shows. It puts you in the trench. You smell the chlorine gas. You feel the lice. You watch Paul's classmates get blown apart until you can't remember what peace felt like. And then it asks, quietly, was this worth it? Propaganda is loud. Truth is quiet. And quiet is harder to shout down. Here's the twist ending the Nazis didn't see coming. They lost, not just the war, the battle over this specific book. All Quiet on the Western Front is still in print. Tens of millions of copies sold. Taught in schools worldwide. Adapted into Academy Award-winning films, including a 2022 German production that swept the BAFTAs. The book the Third Reich feared is now assigned reading for German schoolchildren. Think about that irony for a second. The regime tried to erase this book from existence. Now their own descendants are required to read it. And where is the 1,000-year Reich? Gone. Dust. A cautionary tale we teach children so they recognize the warning signs. Remarque died in 1970, peacefully, in Switzerland. He spent his final decades writing more books, and marrying the movie star Paulette Goddard, and watching his enemies get tried at Nuremberg. He never returned to Germany. Why would he? The country that had burned his books and killed his sister wasn't home anymore. Home was wherever the truth could be spoken freely. His book outlived the people who burned it. The Nazis thought they could kill ideas with fire. They were wrong. You can burn every copy, and the ideas survive. They get passed down, whispered, remembered. Words are harder to kill than people. When you see someone burning books, releasing mice in theaters, banning films, silencing voices, they're telling you something. They're telling you they're afraid. They're telling you their ideas can't survive a fair fight. Remarque wrote it in the novel's dedication. This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all, an adventure. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was just telling the truth about what happened to him and his friends. And for that, one of the most powerful regimes in history, threw his book into a fire and killed his sister. It didn't work, it never works.